Denver Broncos head coach Sean Payton believes that his young team can be dangerous. We'll dive into every aspect that we believe to be true about that statement as the Broncos gear up for the 2024 regular season. It is here. You get that today on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Broncos Country? Welcome into another episode, Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, Broncos reporter from Mile High Sports, joined alongside, as always, by Sayre Bedinger, site expert over there at predominantlyorange.com. I just want to say thanks once again to everyone in Broncos Country, all the everydayers out there. Thanks for making us your first listen. Don't forget, you can get the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast. So if you haven't done so already, or if you're a brand new viewer or listener, hit that subscribe or that follow button so you never miss out on objective coverage of all things Denver Broncos related. And on today's brand new episode of the show, we got a lot to break down as we are just 1 week away from the start of the NFL regular season. Denver will open up week 1 against the Seattle Seahawks. We'll dive deep into Sean Payton's thoughts on really assembling this current 53-man roster, his thoughts and insights into some of their younger players that they have on a developmental trajectory, talking about the wide receiver position, the team's difficult decision to move on from Tim Patrick, but what he's seen in some other guys in that room. But more importantly, Sean isn't buying the 5.5, and he's got a lot of confidence in what he calls a young and potentially dangerous team this upcoming season. And look, Sarah, I think, you look at it, I know some people have been on social media saying, oh, Sean's putting out receipts here once again. I don't think he is. Like, Sean does not care what the media thinks of him. He doesn't care about what we have to say. He doesn't care about the national perspective. I felt like reading Jeff Duncan's article about him, you got so much more insight into Sean in terms of where he's at now, in terms of his coaching career and his mindset about this team.
And just like last year, he's putting the pressure on himself, right? I mean, it's a very different kind of right on the eve of the season, sort of like, you don't want to call it an expose type of article, but I believe Sean Payton is putting the pressure on himself. Remember last year, he had Russell Wilson's back in that USA Today article, and he made sure that everybody knew that they had been way too harsh on Russell for the way they had been talking about him. And then he backed that up by helping Russell to a pretty good season overall. The Broncos improved by 3 games. Now he's out there saying, look, like, I've never had a season with less than 7 wins, right? And he said to Jeff Duncan in that article, Cody, the next time I have 6 wins in a season will be the first. Like, his mentality right now is so clearly, like you said, it's not focusing in on what people are saying. It's such a bulletproof kind of mentality, in my opinion, right? I mean, it's a total security in the way that he operates. And we see that with the evidence of this roster. It's one of the youngest rosters the Broncos have had in quite some time. And the Broncos, quite frankly, have a veteran coaching staff. So it's Sean Payton and this veteran staff taking on the, I don't know if you want to call it project. If some people in the comments here who have been watching on YouTube have been saying this is a rebuild. And if you want to call it a rebuild, that's great. Sean Payton seems to be confident that these guys, this rebuilding project is going to be able to exceed the expectations of what a lot of people seem to think.
Yeah, and look, the whole idea, like George Payton has come out, Sean has come out, they don't view it as rebuilding in a sense. And, surely, I think when you look at this roster, how many young players they have, you can say, okay, they're rebuilding in a way. I loved Alex Singleton's comments earlier in the week. Javonte came out and said, hey, we are rebuilding, but not in the way of like losing a lot of games. Like you have a new roster, like you're trying to build towards something new. I felt like this one thing here, and look, I see it every day from watching Sean Payton. I watched Sean in his first year as a head coach. He's different this year in terms of what I've seen up close and personal, the way he's interacted with us. I've been very pleased with it. Like Sean is, I think he's relaxed a little bit more. There's a trust factor, I think, in his coaches. He's delegating a lot more. But this from the Jeff Duncan quote at NOLA.com, he's got a nameplate on his desk that says, just coach your team. And then he said that there's this quote that he has on his phone. And look, he says, the highest level of mastery is simplicity. More information is irrelevant and most effort is wasted. but only the expert knows what to ignore. And Sean's response to that was, you get wiser relative to how you burn your battery. He says, there's certain things that I exhausted maybe too much energy on when I was younger. And now at this stage of his coaching career, where he plans on coaching for a while, he's got a young team now. He's got a quarterback in Bo Nix, who has young, impressive traits. We talked to Broncos CEO Greg Penner during the groundbreaking ceremony, the new team facility, talking about how they're going to stick by Bo, and how when Bo was announced as a starter, Greg Penner calls up Bo and says, hey, we're gonna be here. We have your back, through the ups and downs, because I think if we're being realistic, rookie quarterbacks will have their ups and downs, right? And I think that now you have ownership, you have a locker room that's behind a guy like Bo Nix. When he's got his ups, they're going to be there. When he has his struggles, which, inevitably he will struggle at some point. He will have struggles. The team is sticking by him. They have a vision in place with this roster. And that, to me, I think is a difference than what we have seen from this team the last 7 or 8 years. Is it going to translate to more wins? That's the hope, right? There's no guarantee of that. But the approach that the Broncos have had in this last year, this offseason, it's been entirely different than I think many people expected.
It has, and it's resulted in a better energy in the building, in my opinion, Cody, as far as what you can see from the
Every
outside
day.
looking in. Every day, Cody's out there seeing it on the field, in the locker room, from the players, things like that. And Sean Payton said it at the podium just the other day. I mean, he said that the energy has been tangible, and he said that when you look at a young roster like this, like you have to see these guys pass the eye test in order to make the types of bold moves that they've made in terms of moving on from veteran guys, right? Because you don't just go young for the sake of going young. And he gave an example of, like, and we talked about this the other day on the show, actually, Marcus Colston, his name came up. And he gave the example of how you draft Marcus Colston in the 7th round and you end up cutting a former first-round pick, Dante Stallworth, who wasn't drafted by Sean, just like a lot of the players that he's let go of this offseason weren't signed or traded for or drafted by him. So he's talking about how they trade Dante Stallworth because in training camp and in preseason, they see this 7th-round pick, Marcus Colston, showing up and showing out in practice. We have the benefit in hindsight now. When we hear the name Marcus Colston, we think, oh yeah, that dude was a baller for the Saints back in the day. But there was a point where a lot of unpopular decisions were made, including trading away Dante Stallworth, I believe, to the Patriots or Browns or something like that at the time, and Colston getting promoted basically to playing full time. Similar situations are happening here today, where Tim Patrick is getting cut at roster cuts after having a good, preseason and training camp and finally being healthy. And you're promoting Devaughn Vele? Like, people are probably still going to think Vele is Tim Patrick out there wearing number 81, right? So it's not just for the sake of doing it. And Sean said that, and I love that he brought that up, Cody, because it's so important. These guys are passing the eye test. It's not just we're going young and everything must go. It's a fire sale. It's a yard sale. That's the perception from the outside right now, is that this is a fire sale in Denver. Whereas if you're living in the house, you're like, well, no, it's not a yard sale at all. We're actually just trying to trade some older stuff so we can get the newer stuff. I like shoes, Cody. If I want to get a new pair of shoes, I might have to sell some old ones in order to get a new pair of shoes to wear. But it's not because I don't like the old ones or that they don't have any value, but I want to wear the new ones, and the new ones are going to look good. So I don't know if that will land with anybody else but me, but that's kind of how I view it right now.
Yeah, and look, I think that's a great point that you made there, because I see it all the time on social media, and we see it in the comments sometimes, and I try to have patience, because it's like, I'm there, but it's like I'm trying to share the perspective of what I'm seeing. And internally, the organization does not believe that they're like, okay, we're rebuilding. We're not planning to win this year. We're not planning to win next year. We're like 2 or 3, 4 years down the road from being where we want to be. That is not the mindset of George Payton. That's not the mindset of Greg Penner. That's not the mindset of Sean Payton. And so the outside looking in, it's like, wow, these moves that they've made, okay, they're really just kind of throwing away 2024. They're making moves that right now seem unpopular, but if it works out the way that they envision it and things go right for Denver, they get off to a fast start, then all of a sudden the narrative starts to change a little bit. But it's not about belief outside, from the media, from fans, like internally, that those players in that locker room, this coaching staff, they have a belief in what they are trying to achieve, and that's to compete here in 2024. And look, hey, may the odds are, may the odds forever be in their favor. Right now, a lot of people have the odds massively stacked against them, and they're okay with being in that role. And look, obviously, it's a long-going conversation here for the Broncos as things continue to pick up 1 week away from the NFL regular season. Also talking about this young roster, Sean Payton dove a little bit deeper into the young wide receiver room, looking at what Troy Franklin, Devaughn Vele, some other guys bring to the table. We'll dive deep into that here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. Broncos Country. Today's episode of the show is brought to you by our friends over there at 5 Hour Energy. And look, if you stayed up late watching sports or you have a long day of sports programming ahead of you like college football on Saturdays, 5 Hour Energy is perfect because you can take a 5 Hour Energy shot in the morning so you can start and enjoy the rest of your day. With zero sugar and a convenient portable size, it's the perfect pick-me-up for getting stuff done. The 5 Hour Energy website has flavors galore like watermelon, tropical burst, grape, berry, and more. There's a flavor for everyone, so try them all. And on the site, you even have the option to build your own 12-pack or 24-pack. You choose the flavors, and it gets delivered directly to your doorstep. So check it out. If you go to 5hourenergy.com, that is the number 5hourenergy.com, and get some 5 Hour Energy product today, you can use my promo code LOCKEDONFB to receive 20% off your order. This offer is only valid until September 30th on one order and cannot be used with any other promotions. The code is not good on subscription orders. Go to 5hourenergy.com today.
Even after losing some notable players, Sean Payton and the Denver Broncos very excited about the wide receiver room. And he talked about some players that maybe have some question marks surrounding them. Troy Franklin, David Sills on the practice squad, as well as Devaughn Vele, the camp star. What did Sean Payton say about these guys, and why could that potentially translate into a big regular season role for all three? We're going to break it down on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. But thank you so much to every single one of you fans out there that makes Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day. You know that your boys, Cody and Sayre, will always be here for you, breaking down everything for your favorite team, the Denver Broncos, all the news, content, coverage, and more that you want, as well as you can check out some of our other friends here in the Locked On Podcast Network, Locked On Fantasy Football, getting you geared up and set up for the regular season here, maybe making some last-minute transactions. And speaking of last-minute transactions, Cody, nothing really nothing really surprising. Overly surprising is what I meant to say. There's nothing overly surprising about the wide receiver position for the Broncos at roster cuts, aside from the initial shock factor of Tim Patrick being let go. But we kind of expected guys like Brandon Johnson, Jalen Virgil, they could move on. And we talked about this yesterday, but when you lose guys like that, you do lose a little bit of the luster of upside, in the depth that we've been talking about all offseason at that position. But Sean Payton talked about a few guys after practice a couple days ago that, man, it gets you pumped about the future of this position group for the Denver Broncos with some of the young talent they have.
Yeah, and first off, I want to wish Jalen Virgil, Brandon Johnson, well wherever they're at. Obviously, with Brandon Johnson now in Pittsburgh, Jalen Virgil in Buffalo. I had a chance to speak with Jalen, briefly following roster cuts, and then also going into the practice squad signing period. Just a better opportunity for him where he feels like he can come in and play maybe right away and maybe be a return guy, key special teams guy for the Buffalo Bills this season. Certainly a player that does things the right way. Really excited to see what he does. And I'll be tuning into Locked On Bills to see if, Jalen cracks into the rotation this upcoming season there with Josh Allen. But in terms of these young receivers, I think when you look at the perception of the changes of that room, like, okay, hey, Jalen goes elsewhere, Brandon Johnson goes elsewhere. Denver wanted both of those guys back. But for them, it's like, hey, I want to go to a place where I can play right away and contribute. They certainly looked out for themselves, and rightfully so. But then it's like, okay, hey, now the Broncos, their practice squad wide receivers now consist of David Sills, who I think is very underrated as a guy who's probably going to play quite a bit this upcoming season. You get veteran little Jordan Humphrey back, which I think is a very good move for them. And then, I think when you look at the Michael Bandy thing, you're like, what role is Bandy going to play for you at any point of the regular season? It's kind of a question mark, and Bandy's had a great training camp. He's had a solid preseason. But it's like in terms of the regular season, what is he going to bring to the table? You hope you don't have to get to that point, right? And that leads us to Devaughn Vele, the 7th-round pick out of Utah. And Sayre, I think from the onset, really it was from the first day of Broncos rookie minicamp where all the rookies reported. Right after the NFL draft, a lot of people we were raving like, hey, Devaughn Vele, he looks pretty good, right? And it's all right. We're going to get to OTAs. We're going to get to training camp. And then he continued to look the part there. And we're talking about going up and rising above defenders, or he's tightly contested in terms of a player playing coverage on his hip underneath. He goes up and makes a play with the football, like his body control, his ability to contort a little bit. He's got good size. But in terms of like bulk, he's not necessarily bulky. He's got a solid athletic frame, muscular frame. But man, he is athletic. He can jump out of the gym for the Broncos. And so he's a guy that Sean Payton said that they believe they could play week one. George Payton echoed those sentiments. Like, you can throw him in the game against Seattle and you know he's going to play, and he has the chance to make some plays. Vele is an impressive young player. I know the fan base is kind of soured a little bit over Troy Franklin, Sayre, because of, not seeing as much in the preseason. Internally, I can tell you with 100% certainty that they are very high on Troy Franklin, that Troy is coming along at the rate in which they want him to. And I've said it, they don't need him to be a number 2, a number 3 receiver this year, but they believe next year Troy's probably going to have a bigger impact. And we could maybe see that elevate a little bit by midseason here for the Broncos. So, I mean, these two young guys, you're developing, and you're hoping that, hey, if they continue on the trend in which they are internally by the organization, it could mean good things here for this team in the future.
Yeah, traits plus the unknown. You add good coaching into the mix, and that's the formula that this, Sean Payton and his staff are banking on, right? And I think you love to see that with a guy like Troy Franklin, who he said he has rare speed. He's very comfortable catching an in route, then all of a sudden taking it for a big gain. And he talked about, is there development to any of these rookies? Absolutely. Like, he said that Troy specifically is working on his lower body strength and getting stronger there, but he said he's smart. He picks things up. There's good questions that he asks. And he said, I'm excited about him. And I think that's all we need to know about Troy Franklin. I think that when you draft a guy like that after drafting Bo Nix, the instant reaction from the fan base is that, well, those guys, they're going to be just like they were at Oregon from day one in the NFL. We all know that's not how the NFL works, although the optimist in us wants to believe that it can be the case. And Troy's going to come along at his own pace, just like you talked about earlier in the show with Bo Nix and ownership saying, hey, we've got your back, and everybody needed to be patient with Bo as he's a rookie quarterback. The same is obviously true of a guy like Troy Franklin, who could be a huge impact player for this team. But look at Marvin Mims kind of in his rookie season. Maybe is that kind of a fair expectation for Troy Franklin, at least offensively? A couple of games where he makes some big plays. Maybe don't see him all the time, but maybe you get him some fabricated touches. The Broncos, Sean Payton just said it, he has rare speed, and you want to get rare speed out there on the field. So I think Troy is going to play a role this season. It may not be as big as everybody wants, but down the line, it is going to be there. And in spots, it is going to be there. The team is excited about him. So don't believe whatever you read or hear where people are saying like, oh, the Broncos, they would have cut, Troy Franklin if they had better receivers, or they didn't like what they saw from Troy. It's false, obviously. And it's not just lip service here that they're giving. Like Sean said early in the offseason, that is second round grade on this guy.
Yeah. And I always encourage people, be careful who you listen to in terms of where this stuff comes from and how it spreads. Like I said, I haven't seen anything like that. Like, obviously I've touched on the fact that Troy didn't have the strongest training camp, right? He had moments, but he had some drops, but they're patient with him. Like, that's okay. Like, they don't need him to be this big guy right now, which is perfectly fine. But I think he is a quick learner. He'll accelerate into what they want him to be and do, I think, sooner rather than later. Same thing with Devaughn Vele. I think Devon's got a chance to play a little bit more this season. But then, hey, there's David Sills, who we talked about. And Sean had mentioned as well that, really in the process, he was kind of one of those first players they really honed in on. And the thing that I've mentioned so much about David Sills in the last year and a half is this is a guy who does things like he's a true technician at the position. He's not going to wow you with his route running ability or his speed or crazy athleticism. But man, this is a guy who does the dirty work. He does the positional things right. He does his technique stuff right, that if you do it right every single time and you're in a good position, you're going to make plays. I think we saw that this past week against the Arizona Cardinals in the preseason finale. He's a guy that will be elevated a few times. I think this season there's a chance at some point he could be elevated to the 53-man roster. I know the Broncos really like him. Johnny Moe likes him a lot as well. And so it's how do you factor that into the rotation? And our hope is that everyone on this roster can stay healthy going forward. I mean, some excitement in the Broncos wide receiver room, a young room. You got two veterans there in Cortland Sutton. You got a veteran in Josh Reynolds. Got a second-year player, Marvin Mims, who we're hoping to see is going to take a step forward this year. And then you got some young guys behind him. That is a test for this coaching staff. But if it pays off, it could be very, very exciting when it's all said and done. So we're excited about that. But Sean Payton also touched on some other areas of this roster. As we talk about really him believing that this team is young and can be dangerous this upcoming season. When you look at the defensive line, how they've built that, we'll highlight Jordan Jackson and Sean Payton's thoughts on him. On top of that, Frank Crum, a move that we consider very questionable. He shared some good backstory insight into really why the evaluation of Frank Crum and what they see from him. We start to see the vision for some of these players and how it impacts the team. We'll break all that down here on today's episode, Locked on Broncos. Broncos Country. Today's episode of the show is brought to you by our friends over there at eBay Motors. And passion, drive, and patience, the formula for winning championships, is also what keeps your ride or die alive. And at eBay Motors, they have everything that you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Whether that's superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back, because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts that you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Once again, that's ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. As we jump to the fourth quarter action on today's episode of Locked On Broncos, we'll dive deep into players like Jordan Jackson, Frank Crum, as Sean Payton highlights that he believes he has a young team who can be dangerous this upcoming season. With a youth movement approach here by the Broncos, there is a lot of excitement here in Broncos Country from the fan base and internally within the organization, including CEO Greg Penner. Just want to say thanks real quick to all the everydayers out there in Broncos Country. Thanks for making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day. You can get us for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast. So subscribe or follow if you haven't done so already, so you never miss out. We want to welcome in and thank all the new viewers and listeners here of the show as well. Thank you so much. A lot of good momentum as the regular season is upon us. We talk about building this 53-man roster, Sayre. Certainly you and I shared our reactions initially throughout the week on Bleacher Report and our live streams that we did. We did it here on the show. And Jordan Jackson's a guy, even after the game, we said, hey, this guy here made a strong claim to make the 53-man roster. Certainly I did my film review of him at Mile High Sports, and I liked what I saw in terms of just, you see the athleticism there. You see the discipline, but you also see, I think, the improvement in strength from Jordan Jackson, who George Payton called kind of like a project of his that he wanted. But unfortunately, he got drafted by New Orleans a few years ago. But now he's got him in the mix, and now he's on the 53-man roster.
Yeah, I love it. I think as you were saying that, Cody, I just kind of thought of like Cody Roark, who was in the front office in New Orleans when Jordan was drafted there, and George Payton, like the meme where the two guys are like shaking hands, the two really strong guys. That's kind of what I think of when it comes to these guys coming together on Jordan Jackson, because this is kind of the best combination. George got a guy that he wanted in the draft, and Cody now gets to kind of oversee his development in Denver after being in New Orleans, which I like. And so I think when you look at this kind of a player, like Sean Payton said it, we saw the development. If you're charting the early part of his pro career, he said they just saw a tick up. They saw it in practice. They saw it in the game. And so when it comes down to roster decisions like this, you can't help but wonder, like, did he just barely make it, or is he somebody that the Broncos kept just because they felt like they didn't have enough depth on the D-line or whatever? Sean Payton said of Jordan Jackson, he wasn't a borderline decision. So what does that mean? Remember when we had the episode last week or, a little over a week ago about, hey, Sean said that there's maybe 44 guys that have locked up roster spots who could be some potential. We threw Jordan Jackson's name in there as a potential guy that maybe he's one of those guys. It doesn't sound like he was any sort of borderline decision for this team, and he could end up being a factor this season as we look at the Broncos' top four on the D-line pretty consistently. Zach Allen, John Franklin Myers, DJ Jones, Malcolm Roach, those guys are going to play a lot. I think Jordan is going to be active on game days, and I think he's going to be in the mix, in the rotation, not just a guy that they have sitting on the active roster kind of developing in practice.
Not only on defense, but a lot of special teams there. And look, the thing I liked about Jordan Jackson is we saw some things on tape where he can play a 3 technique, which is being lined up on the outside shoulder of the guard. He can play a 2-eye, which is the inside shoulder of the guard. He can play inside the A gap. He can play a split. He can play a 1 technique where he lines up on the center. Like there was a play, one of the plays where he got a sack this past week against the Arizona Cardinals. He was actually lined up in a 3 technique. He shot across the face of the guard into the A gap, and he kind of got upfield to where he was getting held by the offensive lineman. It didn't matter. He found a way to wrap up Clayton Tune for a sack. So this is a guy who has versatility to play, wider if you need him to, or you're just playing inside the A and the B gap where Denver's going to primarily rely on that. But you need rotational guys. Look, as much as I love John Franklin Myers, I think he's going to bring so much to the table, right? Zach Allen, DJ Jones, you're starting 3. In order, I think, for the Broncos to have sustainability in terms of being able to be a good run defense to evolve into that this season, what they weren't last year, you have to have guys that you can platoon and rotate in consistently. Jordan Jackson is going to be a top rotational guy, as is Malcolm Roach. I'm excited because you got to keep those guys fresh. You got to keep those guys healthy. I think Denver's depth at that position now is far more better in terms of quality, in terms of what you're going to get production wise than they've had in the last handful of years. That's also an exciting development, I think, that we're going to see maybe play out. And maybe we can go on the inverse here, maybe look at the offensive line. I know initially when he made the 53-man roster, you and I sat here and were like, wait, why Frank Crum is making the 53-man roster? Well, he didn't look like he had the greatest preseason. And I think Sean actually put it into great perspective, right? Because there were some things I will note that Crum did really well in the preseason, but then there were the 2 or 3 sacks that he gave up. And it's like, a little bit of a project. But we don't always get to see the practice tape, right? And that's something that Sean Payton mentioned specifically. He said, when we do a player comparison of our guys, when we look at other players around the league that we might have on our list, because it really seemed like a decision like, hey, are we going to keep Frank Crum? Are we going to look at other players around the league that we have our eyes on to bring in at this position? They noted that they really liked what they saw from Frank Crum, not just, in some of the things in preseason, but what they've seen, the whole body of work, which I think when we talk about it, the whole body of work is something that Sean has said from day one is the most important.
Yeah, and it is. And we've heard now both Sean Payton and George Payton not come out and make excuses for Frank Crum's sacks, both admitting yeah, we all saw, right? We all saw the sacks that he gave up. But at the same time, did you see this other stuff? And I think that kind of encompasses the whole discussion of this Broncos team a little bit, doesn't it? It's like, yeah, you saw the Russell Wilson and the Jerry Jeudy and all these other moves, but did you see what we did over here? Like, did you see the John Franklin Myers, the Malcolm Roach, all these other moves? So it's kind of funny how that just all encompassing the attitude towards this team, and even those of us that are watching the team and covering the team, right? And being like, all right, Frank Crum kind of struggled a lot in the preseason from my vantage point, at least, and saying he's definitely going to be a practice squad guy at best. And then Sean and George come out and talk about, man, he's got these traits. He's got the bend. He's got the footwork and the power in the running game and all these sorts of, a lot of good tape out there. So I like the mentality. And look, those 2 guys, they've sold me on the Frank Crum being on the 53. I don't care if the guy is going to be inactive every week, right? And maybe he could play the Quinn Bailey type role, right? At some point, because I mean, why not? If he's got that kind of power and he helps you out in the running game, that could be a great way to get him just kind of acclimated into the NFL. So, and I know we've talked about Frank Crum a lot, and we get comments and things like that from people wondering, hey, why are you talking about Frank Crum and these sorts of things? I think the situation with Frank Crum is really indicative of the direction the team is going, not to make a mountain out of a molehill, right? But he's the type of guy that the Broncos are investing in players that they believe in the vision of, right? It's you're seeing the best in this guy. I think Sean gave another example of this, Cody, at practice as well, where he talked about a specific player. Maybe you can remind me who exactly he was talking about, but he brought up another name of a player from the Saints that he had at some point, and he was like, you see what this guy's doing, you see the vision there, not everybody else sees it. And so it's one of those things that's kind of indicative to me of the overarching theme of this offseason once again, as opposed to just, well, we're so focused on Frank Crum and his presence on the 53. No, it's more so the big picture type stuff with this roster.
Yeah, and ultimately we're going to figure out how it shapes out because look, week 1 of the NFL regular season, is just around the corner. We're excited for it because that means that, hey, we're getting into our regular season mode where you're going to have practice recaps. You're going to have crossover Thursdays, in-depth game previews from Sayre Bedinger and myself as we look at this roster, all the changes that are going to happen throughout the year. And we're hopeful that this team can remain healthy. And we hope that they can be competitive, because if they're competitive, they're winning games. You know what it means, Broncos country? It means that you and both of us, we're going to have a lot of fun this upcoming season. And look, I think regardless whether they win, whether they lose, as long as the Broncos are competitive and they're building towards something, I think there's a lot we can be excited about. Being at practice every day, I'll tell you the one thing, just talking to the players and how excited they are about this team. It's young, and yes, they're going to have ups, they're going to have downs. But I think that the energy of this team, the belief that these guys have in one another, I think that Denver can surprise some people this year, even though a lot of national pundits who never attend practice don't even know the back end. They don't even know what this roster even looks like because they don't even choose to pay attention. They just go on and spew their nonsense on national airwaves. There's a pride factor inside these guys in the locker room that, hey, we know what we can do. If we can do it the way that we've been coached to, and we believe that we can go out there and shock some people this season, I think Denver will be competitive. I think they'll be a fun team. And if they can piece those things together, as Sean Payton believes they can be, a dangerous team. But with that said, Broncos country, that will wrap up today's episode of the show here, Locked On Broncos, wherever you get your podcast. We appreciate you so much, all the everydayers and first listeners out there in Broncos country. For your second listen of the day, make sure you go check out the Locked On Fantasy Football podcast so you can get your lineups adjusted for week one with some of the matchups that are happening. Locked On Fantasy Football, they have you covered. Sayre Bedinger, myself, will be back on Monday as we preview game week. What are our expectations? What are the biggest things we're looking for as the regular season begins? You'll get that on Monday's episode, Locked On Broncos.